Is there a better way to spend the Easter holidays than going to Crystal Palace matches?
The deadly Eagles are going to win.
Seeing them bang in the goals?
Shut up!
Shut up!
Yeah! But hell, this doesn't compare to the joy of writing and making IGCSE English language videos. This one is on question 3c from paper 1 of the CIE 0627 IGCSE English language course. The question in which you need to compare the views and ideas, the evidence and the language of two texts. It's a tricky question, hence this invaluable revision guide. Stay tuned, this is Schofield on Shakespeare. In order to help you navigate between sections particularly useful to you, I've colour-coded headers as shown below. Yellow summarises the format of 3C and includes the top 3 bands of the mark scheme. If you're aiming any lower, this video is not for you. Pink shows 2 sample passages with a question. Purple gives you some tips and ideas for structuring each section of your answer with separate advice given for each bullet point. Black is my model answer. Grey contains annotations of this model answer showing how it meets the different criteria of the mark scheme. Blue gives you another 2 sample passages and a question to have a go at. Peach shows my model answer to this question. Red shows the model answer annotated. So you have 2 different passages to read, and of course you would already have read the first one, passage B, for question 2 of this exam. You need to compare and contrast the views and ideas within the 2 texts, the evidence used to support these views and ideas, and the language, structure and techniques used by the writer and why they are effective. 20 marks is available for this question, and they are all reading marks. So theoretically, as long as the examiner can understand what you're saying, you should not get a lower mark for, say, spelling or punctuation errors. Here are the top 3 bands of the mark scheme. Some general points. It is not enough to be analysing each passage separately. You need to be regularly comparing them. Especially at the beginning of your answer, I would recommend doing 2 to 3 sentences on one passage before switching to compare and contrast this with the other one. I would also do this within the same paragraph so that it is clearer to the examiner that you are genuinely comparing. This is an area in which pupils I teach have been losing marks. Think of 1F of this exam. You need to be exploring the effects of individual words and techniques in detail. So, you need to be explaining what powerful standout words mean in the context before going on to explore their effect. Do these words help convince us of a certain point of view? Do they reveal bias? Tell us. You need quotations for this question, but I would suggest only using them for the second, evidence, and the third, language and structure, bullet points. For the first bullet point, writer's ideas, show you have assimilated these by using your own words. And finally, you need critical evaluations. As we have discussed endless times during our lessons, evaluate means to probe and to give your own opinion. To what extent is the writer convincing with, for instance, his use of evidence or language? This needs at least a few sentences following a quotation. Here is a sample passage B. Note that I deliberately call it passage B as this is what it would be called in the exam. Passage A would be for question 1. This video is just about question 3C, in which you will need to explore a passage B and a passage C. Read it carefully to yourself and press pause. Here's the companion passage C. Read it carefully to yourself and press pause. The great thing with this exam is that although the text will be unfamiliar, the format of the questions will be well nigh identical. For the first part of this video, you will be working on the question on screen. How do the writers of Passage B, online blog about hooliganism, and Passage C, newspaper opinion piece on hooliganism, convey their views and ideas about football hooliganism? In your response, you should compare and contrast the views and ideas each writer presents to the reader, the evidence that the writers use to support their views and ideas, the language, structure and techniques used by the writer and why they are effective. Some of you may be in a position to attempt your response straight away. But before you do this, here are some structures and tips that you might choose to use to improve your answer. For instance, you might start exploring the writer's views and ideas with this structure. Note that it requires you to give 3 different views and ideas for Passage B before contrasting these with 2 views and ideas from Passage C. When it comes to exploring evidence, you might consider this structure. Firstly, make a statement about one of the writer's use of evidence, such as referencing experts or people quoted, using statistics, or perhaps more frequently, relying predominantly on their own personal experience. Back up this statement with a short, precise quotation, and then evaluate it. This is where you get your marks. Aim to write 2, perhaps 3 sentences probing this evidence. To what extent does it slightly convince? To what extent is it a little weak? Then switch to probing the evidence of the other passage and compare. Here's an example of this. Press pause on screen to read it now. Note that the evaluation is clearly the longest section. The third bullet point requires you to explore the writer's language, structure, and techniques. I suggest using something similar to that used for evidence. First, a statement about one of the writer's use of language. Then, a quotation to back it up. And then some 1F style analysis of individual words and techniques, i.e., what do these words mean in the context? You may also choose to evaluate these words. How convincing and effective are they? Following your analysis, compare the language use in the other texts. Here's how this might look, referencing the passages and questions we have explored already. Press pause to read and scrutinise now. Your turn. Here is the question. I would suggest copying it out to ensure that you know exactly what you're doing. 5 seconds after this slide, Passage B will reappear, followed by a further 5 seconds later, Passage C. I would allow yourself around 45 minutes to produce an outstanding examination response now. Press pause and toggle between the question and the 2 passages. How'd you get on? In a moment, you will be able to compare your response to one that I have written. However, although you will probably not be able to give yourself a precise mark, you should be able to approximate. For example, do you have plenty of comparisons throughout? Do you use short quotations when exploring the structure and language? Do you evaluate? And does your evaluation regularly consist of 2 or more probing sentences? Try to give yourself an appropriate mark now, pressing pause. Here's my response. I'll read it now. As I'm reading, be thinking how this meets the mark scheme. The writer of Passage B suggests that some people can achieve tremendous adrenaline rushes from football hooliganism and can even relish being seen as an official danger to the public by the police. He also states that participating within a violent gang at a football match is even more fun than luxury hotel stays, a whole range of drugs, and expensive champagne. In a different way, the writer of Passage C believes that British football used to have far more problems with football hooliganism, and that nowadays Russian football needs to be more worried about the racist and violent behaviour of some of its supporters. The writer of Passage B also feels that today's hooligans are less violent than in the past, and argues that their actions are superficial and attention-seeking rather than genuinely threatening. This view is echoed by the writer of Passage C, who uses imagery to suggest that British hooliganism is more like an irritant rather than a significant pervasive problem. Finally, the writer of Passage B suggests that serious football hooliganism may have been more popular in the past due to the comparative lack of leisure pastimes, and the fact that at a match you either had to join in with the violence or be attacked yourself. The writer of Passage B uses primarily his own personal experience to support his views and ideas. He is happy to give his full name, the club he supports, and even states that I was classified as a Category C risk to the authorities. The fact he is happy to give his full name and his club gives a degree of confidence and authenticity to his words, whilst the fact he is able to quote a specialist police classification level, Category C, strongly implies that he is likely to be telling the truth about his own experiences about the fun of football hooliganism. In contrast, the writer of Passage C uses research statistics to highlight historical problems of British hooliganism. He states that 150 England fans were arrested for vandalism, fighting and theft in Luxembourg, of all places, after a riot that caused £100,000 worth of damage. This reference to a specific historical event, with exact references to the amount of damage caused and the number of arrests, makes the reader more inclined to think that the writer has carefully researched his topic, and so his view that hooliganism used to be a disease should be respected. The writer also refers to a book published about football hooliganism in the 1980s, Among the Thugs, in which racist and repulsive acts were seen for my friends as an ordinary day out. Whilst these references to research in a book lend weight to his claims about past hooliganism, it is a little difficult to ascertain the extent of the problem. 150 fans is probably only a small proportion of the fans who travelled to Luxembourg, whilst the title of the book, Among the Thugs, seems to suggest that the writer made a deliberate attempt to associate amongst the most violent as opposed to a normal fan. The writer of Passage B seems to have a slightly simplistic view of past hooliganism when he states that you are either a hunter or the hunted, which may imply that he is more interested in boasting about his past violence than giving an objective view. The metaphor hunter suggests that the primary motive of a football hooligan is to hurt and dominate other people, whilst the idea that you are either a hunter or the hunted gives a surely inaccurate impression that everyone at or around a football match was either attacking or being attacked. As previously suggested, the writer of Passage C uses imagery to contrast past and present hooliganism. Whereas football hooliganism used to be the English disease, it is more like a cold sore now. This is effective as it suggests how football hooliganism has been transformed from something which can kill or affect large groups of people, a disease, into something which is superficially slightly ugly but ultimately unlikely to cause extensive harm, a cold sore. Whereas the writer of Passage C uses reasonably sophisticated imagery, the writer of Passage B uses far more colloquial language, which gives an authenticity to his views and ideas. For instance, he reveals in his blog, "When I was bang at it, I loved every effing minute of it." The use of the colloquial expression bang at it, presumably suggesting in the middle of some adrenaline-fueled violence, is effective as it reinforces the reader's prejudices and stereotypes about the type of person who would engage in hooliganism, someone of a lower class. In addition to imagery, the writer of Passage C uses eye-catching rhyming phrases in order to emphasise his view about the incompetence of British governments at dealing with historic hooliganism. The British government offered bluster and fluster and back-of-the-envelope solutions. The words bluster and fluster imply that the British government may have talked in a loud, aggressive way about hooliganism, but behind the words there was little idea about how to manage the problems. This is reinforced by the lack of professionalism suggested within the image back-of-the-envelope solutions. The language of Passage B is not crafted to the same extent, but, as you would expect from a blog, it is structured using shorter paragraphs to draw attention to some of his points about both the danger of hooliganism and the excitement. At one point, the writer uses a short sentence for effect. Simple answer, the buzz. This draws the reader's eye firmly to the writer's key motivation for indulging in football-associated violence, the adrenaline rush, without any other superfluous words or phrases getting in the way. So how does this meet the criteria? Well, there are perceptive comparisons throughout, including those highlighted in blue on screen. Phrases such as "in a different way," "also," and "this view is echoed by the writer of passage C" are clear evidence of comparisons. At other points in my response, I also use words and phrases such as "in contrast," "whereas," and "the language of passage B is not crafted to the same extent." My strong advice is to structure your response following the bullet points in the question. So your first few paragraphs focus on views and ideas, then evidence, then language and structure. Make sure that you use your own words to show that you have genuinely assimilated the writer's views and ideas, rather than copy them without necessarily showing your understanding. On the top half of the screen, you can see a section of my response, whilst in the bottom half in italics you can see the section of the text from which I have extracted my point. Note how I have radically changed the formality of the writer's views and ideas. From being bang at it and looking every effing minute, I have deduced that some people can achieve tremendous adrenaline rushes from football hooliganism. You do need to have more than a couple of points about the views and ideas of each passage. Note how I have squeezed 2 different views and ideas into the first sentence on screen to merit 2 ticks from the zealous examiner. I do think the views and ideas need to be captured in some detail. It is not enough to just state the writer of passage B is pro this, whilst the writer of passage C is anti that. With the section on screen, I have referenced in my own words 3 things which the writer says don't come close to the excitement of football hooliganism: luxury hotel stays, drugs, and expensive champagne. Now on to evaluation. With this section on screen, I have evaluated the writer's use of evidence and reference to historical hooliganism in Luxembourg. I give my opinion on this as evidence and write, "This reference to a specific historical event, with exact references to the amount of damage caused and the number of arrests, makes the reader more inclined to think that the writer has carefully researched his topic before concluding, and so his view that hooliganism used to be a disease should be respected." Another example of evaluation is on screen now, but this time about language. I'm not convinced by the writer's suggestion that around football grounds you are either a hunter or the hunted. First, I analysed the language. The metaphor hunter suggests that the primary motive of a football hooligan is to hurt and dominate other people, before questioning its veracity, before evaluating. The idea that you are either a hunter or the hunted gives a surely inaccurate impression that everyone at or around a football match was either attacking or being attacked. Note also the use of ideally fairly short, precise quotations when exploring evidence and language. The one on screen is just 8 words. You need to show your understanding of the meaning and effects of language before analysing it in detail and exploring its effects. Here, I pick apart the colloquial expression "bang at it," suggesting that it means in the middle of some adrenaline-fueled violence, before suggesting that the effect is to reinforce the reader's prejudice and stereotypes about the type of person typically engaged in hooliganism. Prior to the analysis, of course, there's the quotation, the precise and cogent textual reference. But always remember that you need to be regularly comparing. Note how I begin this paragraph, "whereas." This allows me to sum up a contrasting point about the language of passage C before returning to analyse the language of passage B in detail. Here's another example of detailed and convincing language analysis. I explore the phrase "bluster and fluster" and suggest that it implies that the government may have talked in a loud, aggressive way about hooliganism, but behind this facade they were bloody clueless. This may be enough for some of you. But for those of you really keen to crack this tricky question, coming up now are another 2 passages and another sample question for you to have a go at, followed by my own model answer. Let's carry on. Passage B, about school exchanges. Read it on your own now and press pause. Here's the comparable passage C. Read it now, pressing pause. And the question should look agonisingly familiar. It is, how do the writers of passage B, newspaper reports on school exchanges, and passage C, the writer reflects upon a school exchange, convey their views and ideas about the benefits of school exchanges? In your response, you should compare and contrast the views and ideas each writer presents to the reader, the evidence that the writers use to support their views and ideas, the language, structure and techniques used by the writers, and why they are effective. Have a second go at producing an outstanding response to this question, aiming to spend around 45 minutes. The two passages will appear on screen consecutively after 5 seconds each. Press pause now and start writing. Here's a quick reminder of the mark scheme. You should be getting better now at judging your own writing. How perceptive and regular have your comparisons been? How detailed and convincing is your analysis of language and techniques? What about your critical evaluations? Where do you evaluate, and how perceptive and detailed is it? Spend some time thinking about this. Press pause. Here's my answer. The writer of passage B suggests that school exchange trips abroad can enthuse young people and help them become much better at a foreign language. The writer of this article also suggests that attending a school exchange abroad can play a part in encouraging young people to study a foreign language at university. Whereas the writer of passage B discusses overseas school exchange trips, the writer of passage C refers to an underwhelming exchange with a state school within the UK. He writes that the exchange may have been intended to make those from private schools more socially aware, but actually it made him realise that some people at certain state schools can be very well off as well. His view, resulting from his school exchange, is clearly that it is too simplistic to assume that experiences at state schools and private schools must necessarily be very different. In a different way, the writer of passage B feels that some schools are not arranging international exchanges due to concerns about the potential dangers of young people being abroad and the problems of missing lessons at their home school. The writer's view is that this is a missed opportunity, as he feels that international school exchanges increase the chances of proficiency in a foreign language, something so useful in business. Whereas the writer of passage B seems overwhelmingly positive about school exchanges, the writer of passage C is more ambivalent. His experience is that the classes were comparable in content, although there were more pupils, including females. In terms of the social experience, he clearly objects to the assumptions made by his host parents about his own personal wealth. The writer of passage B refers extensively to statistics to back up his view that schools, particularly state schools, are increasingly reluctant to send their pupils on overseas exchanges. He writes that 39% of British secondary schools take these children abroad, and less than a third of local authority maintained schools run these exchanges, 30%, compared with more than 3/4 of independent schools, 77%. The researcher's source is referenced, YouGov for the British Council, a well-known polling company traditionally used in the run-up to elections, and the statistics are subdivided into independent and state schools. The overall effect is highly convincing and suggests to the reader that there is very clear national evidence to support his view that the number of pupils being sent on overseas exchange trips is declining. Whereas the writer of passage B uses statistics from a well-known polling company and references schools in general, the writer of passage C refers to simply his own personal experience going on a school exchange as a child. In his opening sentence, he reveals that he exchanged his famous all-boys boarding school for a week at a state school in Watford, North London. Although the reference to an exact location suggests his experience is authentic, it is clearly from a very personal viewpoint, and there is no sense that his feeling of being inappropriately patronised by host parents may be applicable to school exchanges in general. By contrast, the writer of Passage B contains a quotation from a school's advisor at the British Council, someone who the reader would expect to have an excellent overview of education and exchanges, who states that it's a shame that these exchanges have fallen victim to things like safety concerns, which can actually be easily remedied with the right steps. The use of this quotation from an obvious specialist in the field adds to the overall effect that the writer has a broad insight into the issues surrounding school exchanges abroad. She is able to cite a reason for the decline in overseas exchanges, safety concerns, and the use of this specific reason contrasts with the vaguer tone and language used within Passage B. Was it successful? Not really, no. The overall impression is that Passage B is a source of reliable information relating to school trips abroad, whereas Passage C is a purely personal recollection of a somewhat unsatisfactory single experience. The language of Passage B is predominantly factual and formal, whilst the writer of Passage C uses a range of rhetorical devices to engage the reader and capture their attention. He uses consecutive rhetorical questions in his opening paragraph. How would we fare? What would the girls make of us? Which reflects the sense of excitement and uncertainty of a young person about to embark upon an exchange. The writer also includes descriptions of small personal details in order to emphasise the wealth of the writer's host family. He states that they gushed to him as his eyes bulged at the luxurious leather sofas, an extraordinary array of technological gadgets. The verb bulged hyperbolically suggests that his eyes are physically looking larger due to his feelings of being overwhelmed by the wealth on display. The adjective luxurious further draws attention to just how expensive and comfortable the sofas appear. Whereas the writer of Passage C engages the reader through referencing personal details, the writer of Passage B uses predominantly complex formal sentences giving general information about school exchanges. For example, the writer states, "However, many people who have gone on to learn a language to a high standard claim that exchange visits during their childhood inspired them." The use of the connective however paves the way for the writer to introduce drawbacks to the decline in overseas exchange trips, which continues the overall impression of a detailed, balanced account. Perhaps terms like many people and claim seem initially a little vague, but in the subsequent sentence the view is backed up with a statistic from a separate survey, thus ensuring that the reader has full confidence in the writer's broad knowledge of the topic. Now time to analyse the mark scheme, a little quicker this time. Well, comparisons throughout, on screen, whereas, and in a different way, but in other sections I also used whilst, by contrast, and more. You need a range of detailed points, comparing the writer's views and ideas in your own words. As previously, you can see the section from the text I have referenced in italics in the bottom half. Evaluation is most certainly required, in which you give your opinion and weigh up the evidence used by the writer to support his views. Here I suggest that the evidence is highly convincing by pointing out that the researcher's source is referenced is from YouGov for the British Council, both highly respected organisations, and also that the statistics have been subdivided. Another example of evaluation. Passage C is clearly from a far more personal viewpoint, and here I suggest that whilst the reference to the exact location of Watford suggests an authentic experience, it is very much a personal experience rather than something more widely applicable. What's annotated on screen now? Firstly, in blue, a perceptive comparison is facilitated by the use of the word whilst. Brown, a quotation to back up the point, just 11 words and consisting of 2 rhetorical questions. Purple, this is where I'm accessing the highest marks. I explore language in detail, suggesting that the verb bulged hyperbolically suggests that the writer's eyes are physically looking larger due to his feelings of being overwhelmed by the wealth on display. I also probe the adjective luxurious, and indeed the use of this term further implies to the examiner that I know how language works. Another example, blue, whereas forces a comparison. Purple, I explain in detail the effect of the use of the connective however. Yellow, evaluation. On the one hand, that particular sentence may seem a little vague, but the subsequent one contains a statistic from a separate survey, thus leading me to evaluate that overall the writer has a broad knowledge of the topic.
Good grief, you've managed to get this far and possibly have knocked off 2 outstanding practice 3C questions. So maybe, just maybe, you're on track for that grade 9 overall. This has been a Schofield on Shakespeare production exploring 3C from the 0627 CIE IGCSE English Language Paper 1. Thank you very much for watching.